A blended family is supposed to mean a second chance. The woman who steps into a mother's role is supposed to be the person who shows up, who stays, who builds something new inside a house that has already known loss. She is the one who makes school lunches. She is the one who sits at the kitchen table when the homework gets hard. She is the one the children are told to trust. But for the families in these cases, that trust became the weapon. They were in the kitchen when the bread came out of the oven. They were asleep on a farmhouse floor while the shotgun was loaded. They were in the living room in their pajamas on a quiet December afternoon. They were children who believed the woman in the house was safe. Today, we are covering 10 women who stood in the role of mother and used it to destroy the families that had let them in. Case 1. Oriana Myers. December is supposed to be the quietest month in the mountains of West Virginia. The Appalachian ridgelines hold the cold, and the hollows fill with a kind of stillness that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with the way sound carries differently when the trees have let go of their leaves. In the small community of Williamsburg, in Greenbrier County, the houses along Flynn's Creek Road sit close to the water and close to each other, the kind of neighborhood where a fire can be seen from 2 roads over and heard before it is seen. On the afternoon of December 8, 2020, shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, someone driving past the 2-story home at 611 Flynn's Creek Road called 911 to report a structure fire. When the fire crews arrived at 3:50 in the afternoon, the home was already badly damaged. The flames had moved fast. By the time investigators began to understand what had happened inside that house, the story had become something that Greenbrier County had never had to reckon with before. Inside were 5 children. Their ages ran from 1-year-old to 7. None of them had made it out. The woman at the center of the case was named Oriana Antoinette Myers. She was 25 years old. She had grown up in West Virginia in the way that many young women grow up in rural Appalachian communities, surrounded by family, embedded in the rhythms of small-town life, connected to a place even when that place offered very little in return. She had married a man named Brian Bumgarner, and together they had made a home on Flynn's Creek Road in a 2-story house that sat just above the hollow. The home was modest in the way that most homes in that part of Greenbrier County are modest. It was the kind of place where the children could be loud in the yard and nobody was too far away to hear them. Oriana and Brian had 3 sons together. The youngest was Hyken Jirachi Myers, who was 1 year old at the time of the December killings. The middle son was Arikile Nova Myers, who was 3. The oldest of their shared boys was Kian Myers, who was 4. 3 small children under the age of 5, who had never known any home other than that house on Flynn's Creek Road. Brian Bumgarner had also been married before. From that previous marriage, he had 2 sons, Sean Dawson Bumgarner, who was 7 years old, and Riley James Bumgarner, who was 6. Sean and Riley lived in the home with their father and Oriana. Their biological mother was a woman named Raven Frisbee, who had lost custody of the boys in 2016, following a Child Protective Services case involving apparent neglect. Raven had, in the time since, tried to maintain whatever contact she was permitted. She was not part of the Daly household. The Daly household was Oriana, Brian, and 5 boys spread across 4 years of childhood, the oldest just learning to read, the youngest just learning to walk. Sean and Riley, by every account that exists of their short lives, were the boys that Oriana was raising alongside her own biological children. She was their stepmother. She was the woman who picked them up from the school bus. She was the woman who fed them. She was the woman who put them to bed. In the weeks and months before December 8th, the home on Flynn's Creek Road had been under a particular kind of stress. The family vehicle had been involved in a crash, which left them without reliable transportation during the week. Brian, who needed to get to work, had begun staying with other family members during the workdays, coming home when he could. This arrangement had been, in the words of Greenbrier County Sheriff Bruce Sloan, a tremendous source of contention between Oriana and her husband. Text messages recovered from her phone in the days before the fire gave some shape to the state she had been in. In one message to Brian, she had written that money comes and goes, but that once she was gone, there would be no replacing her. She told him she begged and cried for help, but never got it. She told him her mental health needed tending to. She asked him to help her. She told him she did not care anymore. There had been no formal mental health treatment, There had been no history of mistreatment of the children that law enforcement had been made aware of. Child Protective Services had never been contacted about the Myers-Bumgarner household. From the outside, and even from the inside as understood by neighbors and family, the situation was a young couple under financial and logistical pressure. A mother at home alone with 5 young boys during the week. A husband who had chosen a temporary arrangement that had gone on longer than either of them had expected. The kind of situation that many families in rural West Virginia lived through without catastrophe. The kind of situation that, in almost every other case, resolves itself when the car gets fixed or the bus schedule changes. But Oriana was carrying something that the text messages only partially described. In the notes she left behind, she called it her demons. She did not elaborate further on what those demons were. She only said they had won. On the afternoon of December 8th, at around 2:30, surveillance footage from the school bus captured Oriana at the bus stop, waiting for Sean and Riley to step off. She was wearing a coat with the hood up against the December chill. One of the boys, stepping down from the bus, looked at his stepmother's face and asked her a question. He asked if that was blood on her face. Across the bridge of her nose, from one ear to the other, she had drawn a red line. She told the boy she had just drawn on her face. She turned and walked them home. The bus pulled away. The road went quiet. What happened inside the house after Oriana walked her 2 stepsons through the front door is known from the confession she left behind, duct-taped to the passenger side mirror of the family car in a sealed plastic bag. She had loaded the family's firearm, a single-shot .410 shotgun, before the bus had arrived. She shot all 5 boys in the head, one after the other. She set the house on fire. She walked outside. She shot herself. Her body was found near a picnic table on the south side of the home. The shotgun was beside her. Her face still had the red line drawn across it, from ear to ear. The notes she had left told 3 distinct things to 3 distinct audiences. The first note was addressed to whoever found the car. It gave Brian's phone number. It gave the phone number of Raven, the biological mother of Sean and Riley. It asked someone to call her own mother. It said she was sorry. It said the demons had won and there was no going back. The second note was addressed to no one in particular. It was titled, in her own handwriting, My Confession. It said she had shot all the boys in the head. It said she had set the house on fire. It said she had shot herself. It said mental health was serious. It said she hoped someone would help others like her someday. It said mental health was not to joke about. It said when someone begs and cries for help, please help them. The third note was addressed to Brian. It said she was not strong enough for him or for the family. It said her head was in a terrible state. It said she was sorry for her evil crimes. It said she had not been strong enough to fight the demons. It said she was depressed. It said her heart was numb. It said her soul was completely shattered. It ended with her initials. The 5 children were found inside the ruins. The fire had caused so much destruction that investigators could not immediately locate all of the remains. 4 of the boys were identified quickly. The 5th, the hardest to find, was not confirmed until December 12, 4 days after the fire. The state fire marshal's office determined that the blaze had been set deliberately. There was no longer any question about what had happened or who had done it. Greenbrier County Sheriff Bruce Sloan held a press conference on January 21, 2021, more than 6 weeks after the fire, to announce the official findings of the investigation. He stood in front of the cameras and said what he had to say plainly. He said the investigation had concluded that Oriana Myers had shot the 5 children and then taken her own life. He said investigators could not determine why she had chosen to do what she had done. He said the moral fabric of any community finds it unconscionable that a mother could harm her own children. He said there was no prior history of abuse. He said Child Protective Services had never been called. He said there was no treatment for mental illness on record. He said those things because the questions that were coming would need some kind of answer, even when the answer was that there was no answer good enough. What the press conference could not address, and what has remained in the public record as one of the most painful threads of the case, is what happened to Raven Frisbee in the hours after Brian received the phone call about the fire. Raven had been fighting for years to stay connected to Sean and Riley after losing custody. She had filed reports with Child Protective Services that were, she later alleged in a lawsuit, ignored. She had told the state agency that she believed her children were being mistreated in the household. The DER, according to Raven's lawsuit, had been made aware of her concerns and had not acted on them. When she learned that her two boys, Sean, who was 7, and Riley, who was 6, had been found dead inside the house of the woman she had warned authorities about, she wrote on her Facebook page that Oriana had murdered her babies and that everyone now knew it. She said she had been patient, waiting for the day when the truth would be known. She said she was no longer going to be quiet. The lawsuit Raven Frisbee filed against the DER for negligence was part of a broader series of legal and legislative consequences that came out of the case. The DER was eventually dissolved and reorganized into 3 separate agencies in 2023, following findings of systemic mismanagement. The dissolution was the result of many failures over many years, not any single case, but the deaths of Sean and Riley Bumgarner were among the cases cited in the public conversation about why the agency had needed to change. Brian Bumgarner buried his sons, all 5 of them. The 3 he had with Oriana, and the 2 he had brought into the household from his first marriage. Hakan was 1, Arikaile was 3, Kian was 4, Riley was 6, Sean was 7. The oldest was just old enough to ask about the red line on his stepmother's face at the bus stop. He did not know what would happen when they got home. Neither did any of the others. The notes Oriana left behind said she hoped someone would help people like her. She said mental health was not to joke about. She said please help them when they beg. None of that was heard in time to matter. The home on Flynn's Creek Road no longer stands. The structure that burned on December 8, 2020, was a total loss. The ground where it stood is still in Greenbrier County, a few miles from Williamsburg, in a hollow where the sound carries differently when the trees have let go of their leaves. The worst mass shooting in West Virginia history happened there on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, while a school bus driver pulled away from the stop and the road went quiet behind him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story across the ocean to a small village in the Minya Governorate of southern Egypt, where in the summer of 2025, 6 children from the same family began dying one by one from what the community first believed was a mysterious illness. By the time investigators understood what had truly happened, a stepmother was in custody, a husband and all 6 of his children were dead, and a court had already handed down a sentence that carried the weight of everything the evidence had shown. Case 2, Hajar. In the Minya Governorate of Upper Egypt, where the Nile bends south and the landscape opens into flat fields of sugarcane and dry farmland, the village of Dalija sits in the Deir Mawas district the way thousands of Upper Egyptian villages sit, quiet, close-knit, built around the rhythms of agriculture and family and faith. The houses are made of brick and mud. The streets between them are narrow enough that neighbors can hear each other's conversations through open windows. The bread is made at home, shaped by hand, baked in traditional clay ovens, and sometimes sent between households as a gift or a gesture of goodwill. It is one of the most ordinary acts in a village like Dalija. It is the act that killed 7 people in the summer of 2025. The family at the center of the case was headed by a 48-year-old man named Nasser Muhammad Ali. He had 6 children. The youngest was Ahmed, who was 5 years old. Above him were Omar, 7, Reem, 10, Mohammed, 11, Rahma, 12, and the oldest, Farha, who was 14. 6 children spread across 9 years of childhood. Their biological mother was a woman known publicly in the case records as Hashem, which in Arabic means the mother of Hashem. She was 40 years old. Nasser had, at some point before the summer of 2025, separated from Hashem and taken a second wife, as is permitted under Egyptian law, when a man can demonstrate the means to provide for more than one household. The second wife was a 26-year-old woman named Hajar. In the months before July 2025, something had shifted in the domestic arrangement. Nasser had begun to reconcile with Hashem, his first wife and the mother of his 6 children. The reconciliation was not yet finalized in any formal legal sense, but the direction of it was clear. Nasser was moving back toward his first family. Hajar, who was also pregnant at the time, understood what the reconciliation meant for her. It meant that the position she had held in the household was dissolving. It meant that the husband she had married might soon belong, in practice and in sentiment, entirely to another woman and those 6 children. Investigators would later describe her stated motive in a single phrase: jealousy and revenge. The jealousy was real enough. The revenge, when it came, was methodical in a way that the village of Dalija had never had to reckon with before. What investigators pieced together in the weeks following the first deaths was that Hajar had made 2 separate attempts to poison the family. The first attempt had taken place approximately 4 days before the killings began in earnest. She had prepared bread, the same traditional Shamsi bread that was a staple of daily life in the village, and she had mixed into it a quantity of a pesticide called chlorphenapir. Chlorphenapir is an agricultural insecticide classified by the World Health Organization as moderately hazardous. It is used across Egyptian farmland to control pests. It is not difficult to obtain in a rural community where agriculture is the primary livelihood. In small doses, it is lethal. A professor of toxicology at the Faculty of Medicine at Minya University, who was brought in to examine the case, stated publicly that 0.5 gram of the substance is enough to kill an adult. The professor noted that in more than 35 years of medical practice, he had never encountered a case as strange and complex as the one unfolding in Dalija. The substance works by disrupting the energy production process within the body's cells, causing systemic failure from the inside out. Symptoms can take hours or days to appear, depending on the amount consumed and the individual body's response. Once they begin, there is no antidote. The first batch of poisoned bread Hajar sent to the family did not reach its intended targets in sufficient quantity. Hashem, who received the bread, noticed something off about it. The taste was unusual. She felt an immediate, intense thirst after taking only a small piece. She refused to eat more. The fact that she was typically the one who baked the family's bread made the moment of suspicion more instinctive. She was familiar with what properly made bread tasted and felt like. Something was wrong. She did not know what it was. She set the remaining bread aside. She did not yet suspect that it had been deliberately poisoned. She did not yet suspect that the woman her husband had recently taken as a second wife had placed something into the loaves. The first attempt, for reasons that came down to a single small act of caution, failed. 4 days later, Hajar prepared another batch of bread. She mixed more chlorphenapir into it. She arranged for it to be sent to the family's household. According to court records and the investigation by Egypt's Interior Ministry, surveillance cameras in the village captured 2 of the children themselves walking from Hajar's house to their family's home, carrying the bread. 2 of the children carried the instrument of their own deaths through the narrow streets of Dalija on a summer morning in Upper Egypt, not knowing what was inside the loaves. They were children. They were doing what children in such villages have always done. They were bringing home the bread. The poisoning began on July 11, 2025. The first symptoms appeared as unexplained fatigue, fever, and nausea. 3 of the 6 children were hospitalized within days. Their condition deteriorated faster than the doctors at Minya Hospital could understand. The symptoms did not match any known infectious disease. Meningitis was mentioned as a possibility. The Egyptian Ministry of Health issued a statement denying that any outbreak of meningitis was underway. The doctors called in toxicology consultants from Alexandria University and Ain Shams University. None of them had encountered chlorphenapir poisoning in a clinical setting before. The substance did not appear in conventional laboratory blood tests. It had to be found through specialized analysis, which took time the children did not have. 3 of the siblings died first. Then, as the village mourned and tried to understand what was happening, 3 more became sick. The 2 girls, Rahma and Farha, were transferred to Asyut University Hospital for closer observation. They followed their brothers and sisters one after the other. By the time all 6 children had died, the family's grave had been opened 6 times in 14 days. Nasser Muhammad Ali, the father, had been watching his children disappear one after another. His health deteriorated as his last child died. He was transferred to Asyut University Hospital in increasingly serious condition. 3 days after Farha, his oldest daughter, died, Nasser himself passed away. The poison in the bread had found him too. He had consumed enough of it, over meals shared with the family in the days following the initial poisoning, that his body was failing the same way his children's bodies had failed. A brain scan performed before his death showed extensive damage to the white matter of his brain, consistent with chlorphenapyr-induced toxic injury. The village of Dalija mourned 7 times in 2 weeks. 7 graves opened. 7 people from the same family carried out of the same house and buried in the same ground. The community had lived through the entire sequence of deaths, believing, in those first terrible days, that a disease had descended on one family with a cruelty no one could explain. When the truth emerged, the grief did not lessen. It changed shape. It became something harder and more specific. The investigation moved quickly once investigators confirmed poisoning as the cause of death. The Interior Ministry's security services combed through the evidence systematically. The prosecution inspected Hajar's home alongside forensic experts. In the bread scraps found in her kitchen and on her cooking utensils, they found traces of chlorphenapyr. Surveillance footage showed the children carrying bread from her house. Hashim described the unusual taste of the first batch she had refused to eat. When Hajar was taken in for questioning, she confessed. She confessed to both attempts. She conducted a video simulation of how she had prepared the bread and introduced the poison. In her own words, as recorded by investigators, she said her motive was her fear that her husband was going to leave her permanently for his first wife. She did not dispute the evidence. She did not claim the deaths were accidental. She said she had done it, and she said why. The case moved to the Minya Criminal Court. It was referred to the Grand Mufti, as required by Egyptian law before any death sentence can be formally imposed. On November 8, 2025, the court handed down its verdict unanimously. Hajar, 26 years old, and carrying a 2-month-old infant in her arms when she appeared in the courtroom, was sentenced to death by hanging. The court allowed her to sit outside the defendant's cage during the proceedings because she was holding the baby. The presiding judge confirmed that the court had considered the Mufti's opinion before imposing the sentence. The charges were 7 counts of premeditated murder by poisoning and 1 count of attempted murder in the case of Hashim, who had tasted the bread and survived. Hashim had lost 6 children and a husband. She had survived the attack because she had noticed something unusual about the taste of a piece of bread and refused to eat more. That single moment of hesitation, that instinctive refusal, is the only reason there was a surviving witness. It is the only reason there was someone left who could describe what had happened, who could tell investigators that the bread had tasted wrong, who could give them the thread to follow back to Hajar's kitchen. The case shook Egypt in a way that extended well beyond the village of Dalija. Egyptian forensic scientists published formal calls for action in medical journals, noting that chlorphenapyr had never previously been documented as a deliberate poison in Egypt, that the substance was not part of standard toxicology screening panels, and that without the specialized consultation that finally identified it, the deaths might have been recorded as an unexplained medical cluster and closed without a criminal investigation. The calls for tighter controls on access to agricultural chemicals and better equipped poison control centers were direct responses to what had happened in Dalija. Hajari awaits the final confirmation of her sentence. Under Egyptian law, death sentences are subject to additional review before they are carried out. She was 26 years old when she was sentenced. Her infant was in her arms in the courtroom. The 6 children she poisoned ran from 5 years old to 14. Their father was 48. The bread that killed them was made in the same kitchen where she had been making bread all the time she had been his wife. The same hands that had done something as ordinary and domestic as preparing a family meal, doing something that ended the lives of an entire household of children, one after another, across 14 days, in a village where the streets are narrow enough that neighbors hear each other through the walls. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story back more than a century, to the coal mining communities of County Durham in northeast England, where a woman named Mary Ann Cotton buried husband after husband, child after child, stepchild after stepchild, and collected the insurance money each time. By the end of her life, she was suspected of killing as many as 21 people. She was caught because of one child too many, and because a government official remembered something she had said out loud on a street corner in a village called West Auckland. Case 3. Mary Ann Cotton. Northeast England, in the middle of the 19th century, was a place built on extraction. The coal came out of the ground in County Durham and fed the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution. and the men who dug it lived in villages that grew up around the colliery gates, row houses of brick and soot, streets narrow enough to touch both walls with your arms spread wide. The community at Low Morsley, where Mary Ann Robson was born on the last day of October in 1832, was one of those villages. Her father was a colliery sinker, a man who worked in the shafts, and he was ardently religious and strict in the way that very poor men, who have nothing to offer their children except discipline, sometimes are. When Mary Ann was 8, the family moved to Merton in County Durham. A year or two later, her father fell into a mine shaft and did not come out of it alive. The poverty that had already been grinding became something harder. She left home in her mid-teens. She trained as a nurse and worked as a dressmaker. She married her first husband, a miner named William Mowbray, in 1852. Over the next decade, 4 of the children they had together died, in Cornwall and in County Durham. The cause of death, on every certificate, was gastric fever. William himself died in 1865. Mary Ann collected the life insurance money. She moved on. That pattern, established quietly in the early years of her adult life, would repeat itself so many times over the next 2 decades that the word pattern eventually stopped being adequate to describe it. What Mary Ann Cotton was operating across the coal mining communities of northeastern England in the 1850s, 1860s and early 1870s was not simply a series of tragedies. It was a system. She would enter a household. She would take out insurance on the lives of the people in it. She would wait a reasonable length of time, sometimes months, sometimes less. The people around her would develop stomach symptoms. The doctors, in an era before toxicology was reliable and before anyone seriously questioned a woman's grief, would write gastric fever on the death certificates. Mary Ann would collect the money, grieve in the visible and correct way, and move to the next household. The second husband was a man named George Ward, an engineer she met while nursing at a hospital in Sunderland. They married in August of 1865. 14 months later, George was dead. The doctor who attended him noted that the decline had been remarkably swift, that he had been surprised by the suddenness of the end. He signed the death certificate. Mary Ann collected the insurance and moved on. The third husband was a widower named James Robinson, a shipwright in the Pallion area of Sunderland, who had hired Mary Ann as a housekeeper after his wife had died. Within weeks of Mary Ann's arrival in his household, one of Robinson's children from his first marriage was dead of gastric fever. Then Mary Ann's mother died, having taken ill during a visit. Then Robinson's other children began dying. In one of the case's more telling anomalies, Robinson himself did not die. He was, sources later noted, one of the few people in Mary Ann's orbit who appears to have been genuinely suspicious of her. He refused to take out life insurance on himself. He refused to be insured at her suggestion. When he eventually discovered that she had been forging his signature on banking documents, he ended the marriage and sent her away. He was the only husband who survived. By the time she left his household, 3 of his children from his first marriage were dead. One of the children she had carried herself was dead. Only one child she had with Robinson survived past infancy, and that child Robinson kept away from her. The fourth husband was a man named Frederick Cotton. By the time Mary Ann married him, in 1870, she was technically still married to Robinson, a fact that made the union bigamous under Victorian law. Frederick had 2 sons from his previous marriage. One was named Frederick Jr. The other was Charles Edward Cotton, who was born in approximately 1864 or 1865, and was therefore around 6 or 7 years old when Mary Ann entered his life. He was, by every account that survived him, a healthy and ordinary child. Within a year of Mary Ann marrying his father, Frederick Sr. was dead of gastric fever. Frederick Jr. died shortly afterward. A lodger who had moved into the household, a man named Joseph Nattrass, who had been an earlier romantic interest of Mary Ann's and whom she had recently reinsured, died in early 1872. By the spring of that year, the only insurance policy Mary Ann had not yet collected was the one she had taken out on Charles. Charles Edward Cotton was 7 years old in the summer of 1872. He was the child of his father's first marriage. His biological mother was dead. His father was dead. His brother was dead. The lodger was dead. The only adult in his household was a woman named Mary Ann, who had moved into his father's life 2 years earlier, and who was now the last person standing in a household that had been full when she arrived. Mary Ann had also become pregnant by another man, a local excise officer whose name appears in various historical sources as Quick Manning, and she wanted to be free to pursue that relationship. Charles, alive and in her care, was, in her own words, in the way. In early July of 1872, she went to the local parish official responsible for distributing poor relief. His name was Thomas Riley. She asked Riley whether the workhouse would take Charles. Riley told her that the workhouse would only accept the child if she accompanied him, which she was not prepared to do. When Riley refused to facilitate the arrangement, Mary Ann said something to him on the street outside his office that he did not immediately understand as a threat, but would later recognize as a confession. She told him that Charles would not be a trouble to her much longer. She told him the child would go like all the rest of the Cotton family. Riley was puzzled by the remark. He filed it away. He did not act on it immediately. Within the week, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. The cause of death on the initial certificate was gastroenteritis. An inquest was held. The initial verdict was natural causes. Mary Ann told the inquest she had given the child arrowroot to ease his symptoms, and she accused Thomas Riley of inventing his suspicions because she had refused his romantic advances. The inquest seemed ready to close, but Riley remembered what she had said on the street. He went to the police. The police went to the doctor who had attended Charles during his illness, a man named William Byers Kilburn, and they discovered that Kilburn had kept tissue samples from the boy's body. Kilburn had kept them not out of any particular suspicion, but out of professional caution. The samples were tested. They were found to contain arsenic. The body of Charles Cotton was exhumed. The arsenic was confirmed. Mary Ann was arrested for the murder of her stepson. The investigation that followed the arrest moved outward from Charles in every direction at once. Bodies were exhumed. Natras was exhumed. Frederick Cotton Sr. was exhumed. Frederick Jr. was exhumed. Infant Robert, who had been born to Mary Ann and Frederick and had died shortly after his father, was exhumed. Arsenic was found in every one of them. The newspapers sent reporters to follow the story. What those reporters found, tracing Mary Ann's movements backwards through 2 decades of northern English village life, was staggering. 3 husbands dead, a lover dead, a close friend dead, her own mother dead, at least 11 of her 13 children dead, all of them from stomach ailments. All of them dying quickly and conveniently, all of them in households where Mary Ann had taken out insurance policies before the illness began. The newspaper coverage was the first time the full shape of what she had done became visible in public, and by the time her trial began, the shock across County Durham and beyond was total. The trial was delayed, Mary Ann was pregnant when arrested, and in Victorian England, a pregnant woman could not be executed before she gave birth. She delivered her 13th and final child in Durham Gaol on January 7, 1873. The baby was a girl, and Mary Ann named her Margaret Edith Quick Manning Cotton. The girl was taken from her and placed in the care of others. Margaret Edith would survive into the 20th century, dying only in 1954, outliving her mother by 81 years. She would be the only one of Mary Ann's children who lived long enough to have any adult life at all. The trial opened at Durham Assizes on March 5, 1873. The prosecution was led by a barrister named Charles Russell, whose appointment had been contested enough to generate a question in the House of Commons. The defence argued that Charles Edward Cotton had died not from arsenic administered by Mary Ann, but from arsenic he had inhaled through the green-dyed wallpaper of the Cotton home. It was not an entirely implausible argument in an era when arsenic was routinely used in dyes, paints, and even confectionery. The Bradford sweet poisoning of 1858, in which 15 people had died after accidentally eating sweets containing arsenic, was still within living memory. But the jury was looking at more than the death of one child. They were looking at the totality of what the newspapers had printed, and at a woman who had watched more than 20 people in her immediate orbit die of stomach ailments without raising any alarm of her own. The jury retired for 90 minutes. They came back with a guilty verdict. The sentence was death. Mary Ann appealed. Several petitions were submitted to the Home Secretary. All were refused. On March 24, 1873, she was led to the gallows at Durham County Gaol. The executioner was a man named William Calcraft. What happened next was, by the standards of Victorian justice, a failure. The rope had been rigged too short. When the trapdoor opened beneath Mary Ann Cotton's feet, she did not fall far enough for her neck to break. She did not die quickly. She died slowly, by strangulation, over the course of several minutes that the executioner had to assist by pressing down on her shoulders. The prison surgeon certified the cause of death as asphyxia. Whether the short rope was deliberate or incompetent has never been established with certainty. Some accounts suggest the watching crowd heard more than they expected to hear. Mary Ann Cotton was buried within the walls of Durham Gaol. A plaster cast was made of her face afterward. The baby Margaret Edith, born in prison and removed from a mother who would shortly be hanged, grew up without being told much about her origins. The house at 20 Johnson Terrace in West Auckland, where Charles had died, was eventually demolished. There is now a park bench where it stood. A children's rhyme circulated in the northeastern villages for generations after her execution. Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. The rhyme was still being sung in County Durham schoolyards decades after the woman herself was in the ground. The precise number of Mary Ann Cotton's victims has never been established and cannot be. The forensic techniques of 1872 and 1873 were sufficient to identify arsenic in the bodies they examined, but not sufficient to prove in a court of law that each of those deaths had been caused by deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. She was charged with 4 murders. She was tried for 1. The one she was tried for was the death of a 7-year-old stepson who had become, in her own recorded words, an inconvenience she did not expect to be troubled by much longer. The death of Charles Edward Cotton was the last one she committed. It was the one that caught her, not because of any breakthrough in forensic science, but because she had said something careless to a minor government official on a street corner in West Auckland, and he had remembered it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the present day and moves to the American West, to a quiet subdivision southeast of Colorado Springs, where in January 2020, an 11-year-old boy named Gannon Stouch went missing from his home. His stepmother had made the call to police herself. For weeks, the community searched. What investigators eventually found told a story of violence so severe that the judge who sentenced her would say, on the record, that it was the most horrific thing he had ever seen in a career on the bench. Case 4. Leticia Stouch. On the afternoon of Monday, January 27, 2020, a call came in to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office in Colorado. The caller was a woman named Leticia Stouch. She was calling from the Lawson Ranch neighborhood, a planned residential subdivision that sits southeast of Colorado Springs in unincorporated El Paso County. The kind of development where the streets are wide and the houses are new and the front yards are still being figured out by the families who have recently moved in. Leticia told the dispatcher that her 11-year-old stepson Gannon had left the house that afternoon to walk to a friend's house and had not returned. She said she was worried. She said she did not know where he was. The call was logged as a juvenile runaway. 3 days later, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office reclassified the case as a missing and endangered child after receiving new information. The search that followed became one of the most heavily covered missing child cases in Colorado in years. What ended it, 6 weeks later, was not a rescue. It was a maintenance worker on a bridge in the Florida Panhandle, more than 1,000 miles from Lawson Ranch, who noticed something in the water below. Gannon Stouch was born on September 29, 2008. He was 11 years old when he disappeared and was in the 5th grade at a school in the Colorado Springs area. He had dark hair and a wide, easy smile that appears in almost every photograph that was shared during the search for him. The kind of smile that makes people feel the loss of someone they have never met. He was the son of Eugene Stouch, known to family and friends as Al, who was a member of the Colorado National Guard and was away on a deployment at the time of his son's disappearance. Al had a daughter as well, Gannon's younger sister Lena, who was 8 years old in January 2020. Gannon's biological mother was a woman named Landon Hyatt, who lived separately from Al and whose voice would be heard in courtrooms and on national television in the years to come, speaking about the son she had spent the last years of his life trying to stay connected to. Al Stauch had married Leticia in the years before the disappearance. Leticia was 35 years old in January 2020. She had a daughter of her own from a previous relationship, a 17-year-old named Harley Hunt, who was also living in the home at Lawson Ranch. Leticia had taken on the role of stepmother to Gannon and Lena. Investigators would later note, in the arrest affidavit that was unsealed in May of 2020, that she had reportedly expressed resentment about her role as a step-parent. They would also note that in the months before the disappearance, she had searched on the internet for phrases that no ordinary step-parent searches for, including searches for what blood spurting from an arterial wound looks like. She had also searched the phrase, "I don't like my stepson." She had done these searches while Gannon was alive in the house with her. On the day Gannon vanished, Al was not home. He was away on a National Guard deployment. Lena was at school. Harley was in the home. Leticia was in the home. Gannon was in the home. According to the account Leticia gave to investigators in the hours and days after she called 911, Gannon had left to walk to a friend's house around 3:30 in the afternoon and had simply not come back. The friend's name she provided could not be verified. The story did not hold under even initial scrutiny, and the investigation quickly centered on Leticia as the last known person to have seen Gannon alive. Surveillance footage from a camera installed by a neighbor became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The footage showed Leticia leaving the home with Gannon in her truck at around 10:15 in the morning on January 27th, hours before she would claim he had walked to a friend's house. Investigators believe she returned with him around 2:19 in the afternoon. After that, Gannon did not appear on any footage anywhere. The story she had told about him leaving on foot in the late afternoon did not match anything the cameras around the neighborhood had recorded. Leticia's behavior in the days that followed the disappearance was described in the arrest affidavit in specific, documented detail. She disconnected her phone. She filed a false report with police, claiming that she had been held at gunpoint and sexually assaulted by a Hispanic man she described as a laborer who had been working on a house nearby and whom she had let into the garage to look at a burnt carpet. The story was investigated and found to have no supporting evidence. She lied to investigators about a rental car. She had traveled to the Florida area in early February, a fact that investigators recorded but whose full significance was not yet understood. She had manufactured alibis. She had told fictitious stories to multiple investigators across multiple interviews. The arrest affidavit, when it was finally released, described a woman who had dedicated the weeks following the disappearance of her stepson to building walls between herself and accountability rather than engaging in any meaningful search. The break came on March 17, 2020. A maintenance worker checking the structure of a bridge over Escambia Bay near Pace, Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, found a suitcase below the bridge. Inside the suitcase were the remains of an 11-year-old boy. The cause of death, as determined by the medical examiner, was the result of 3 separate categories of violence inflicted on the same child. Gannon had been stabbed 18 times. He had been struck in the head with a blunt object. He had been shot once, the bullet entering his skull. The medical examiner's ruling on cause of death was blunt force trauma, sharp force injuries, and a gunshot wound. The knife and the blunt object were never found. The bullet that had been fired into Gannon's head was recovered during the autopsy. The suitcase the child's body had been hidden inside was later identified as one that had been in the Lawson Ranch home. Investigators had already connected the Florida area to Leticia through the rental car and the travel records. The suitcase provided the physical link that made the arrest case complete. Leticia Stauch was arrested on March 10, 2020, in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where investigators had tracked her. She was taken into custody by El Paso County Sheriff's deputies and the FBI working together. During the transport back to Colorado, she assaulted a deputy, grabbing at the deputy's firearm and striking her with a can of energy drink. She was restrained and brought back to face charges in El Paso County. The charges were first-degree murder of a child by a person in a position of trust, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. She was held without bond at the El Paso County Jail. Her first court appearance took place in a courtroom in Colorado Springs. From the beginning, her legal situation was complicated by her own behavior. She had accused her husband Al of being involved in Gannon's death. She had alleged that he had connections to drug trafficking organizations and sex trafficking networks. Investigators found no evidence supporting any of those claims. A state mental hospital evaluated her and found her competent to stand trial. In February 2022, she entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense rested almost entirely on a claim that she had been suffering from dissociative identity disorder, a condition caused, her attorneys argued, by childhood sexual abuse she had experienced. Her defense presented a single witness, a controversial forensic psychiatrist named Dorothy Ottnow-Lewis, who had examined Leticia and concluded that she had been in a psychotic state when she attacked Gannon, that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder, and that she had alternate identities including two named Maria and Taylor. Recordings of Lewis interviewing Leticia, in which Leticia spoke in a different accent while presenting herself as Maria, were played for the jury. Leticia spoke as Maria and said she had shot Gannon believing he was an intruder. She said he was not supposed to die. She said it was not supposed to be him. The prosecution's response was methodical. They called 59 witnesses over 5 weeks of trial. Among those witnesses was Leticia's own 17-year-old daughter, Harley, who testified against her mother. Harley said she had no knowledge that her mother had killed Gannon, that she had felt manipulated by her mother, and that her mother had abused her. An FBI agent testified that Leticia had conducted internet searches for phrases about blood spurting from arterial wounds and about her dislike of her stepson. Forensic psychologists who had evaluated her for the state testified that they did not believe she had dissociative identity disorder and suspected she was fabricating it. One expert testified that the condition appeared, in her professional assessment, too theatrical to be genuine. The prosecution's argument was that everything Leticia did after the killing, the cleaned crime scene, the rented van, the drive to Florida, the false rape allegation, the manufactured alibis, the staged stories across multiple interviews, was the work of a person who understood exactly what she had done and was thinking clearly enough to try to avoid being caught for it. The jury deliberated for nearly 8 hours across 2 days. On May 8, 2023, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Leticia showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. She sat between her attorneys at the defense table and took small sips of water while other people around her moved. The judge, Gregory Werner, sentenced her on the same day the verdict was delivered. He imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 2 murder counts, plus additional sentences for the tampering charges. Before delivering the sentence, Judge Werner addressed Leticia directly from the bench. He told her that he could say without hesitation that the facts of this case were the most horrific he had ever encountered. He told her that her conduct deserved the maximum punishment that Colorado law allowed him to impose. He called her insanity claim a disservice and a betrayal to those who actually suffer from mental health conditions. He denied the defense request to strip the additional years of sentencing. Gannon's mother, Landon Hyatt, gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing. She told the court that she prayed she would never have to look at Leticia's face again. She said that justice had been served and that it would not bring her son back. Gannon's father, Al, also spoke. He wept as he described the impossibility of having left his son at home with the person who turned out to be his killer. He told the courtroom that he was sorry. He told Gannon he was sorry. In April 2026, the Colorado Court of Appeals issued a 52-page ruling overturning Leticia's conviction. The court found that the trial court had committed what it described as structural error by denying a defense challenge to remove a juror who had a connection, within 3 degrees of separation, to the state's attorneys. The ruling was not a finding of innocence. It was a procedural ruling about the composition of the jury. The El Paso County District Attorney's Office described the result as disappointing for the office, for Gannon's family, and for everyone who loved him. A retrial was expected to follow. Leticia Stouch, whose legal name had reverted following Al's request to strip her of it, was returned to a pre-trial holding situation while the new proceedings were arranged. The Google searches she had run from inside the house where Gannon was living were among the most discussed pieces of evidence to emerge from the trial. The phrase about not liking her stepson, the phrase about arterial blood. These searches were conducted on the same device, in the same home, with the same child sleeping down the hall, weeks before the afternoon she called 911 and told the dispatcher he had walked to a friend's house and not come back. Gannon's pillow, recovered during the investigation, had 2 bullet holes in it. His blood-stained mattress had soaked through to the pad beneath. The particle board found in a field north of Colorado Springs had his blood on it. All of these things were found in the weeks after Leticia made a phone call to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office and told them, in a voice that gave no indication of what she knew, that her stepson had gone to visit a friend and had not come home for dinner. Gannon Stouch would have been 16 years old in September 2024. He was 11 when he died in the bedroom of the house in Lawson Ranch, in the subdivision with the wide streets and the new houses and the front yards that families were still figuring out. The maintenance worker who found the suitcase under the bridge in Florida did not know what was inside it when he first saw it. He called it in. The suitcase contained a child who had been stabbed, bludgeoned, and shot. The child had been hidden in the luggage and driven 1,000 miles and thrown off a bridge over a bay in the Florida Panhandle by the woman who had spent the preceding weeks telling investigators that she had no idea where he was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case crosses the Atlantic to South London in the winter of 1978, where a 5-year-old girl named Andrea Bernard was kept home from school one Tuesday as punishment. Her older brother Desmond, who was 8 at the time, knew what happened in that house when a child was kept home. He knew because it happened to him too. What he witnessed that afternoon he carried in silence for more than 40 years, until a cold case detective in 2022 picked up the phone and heard a grown man say that he believed his stepmother had killed his little sister and that he had seen enough to know it was true. Case 5, Janice Nix Thornton Heath, is a neighbourhood in the London borough of Croydon, in the southern part of the city, the kind of area that has been working class for a very long time and that in the late 1970s was home to many families who had come to Britain from the Caribbean during the post-war decades and built their lives in the crowded streets and Victorian terraced houses that run between the railway stations and the high roads. The summers there were short and the houses were close together, and the lives of neighbours were not entirely private. In one of those houses, in the summer of 1978, a 5-year-old girl named Andrea Bernard was placed into a bath of scalding water. She screamed that it was too hot. She was kept in the water. Her screaming stopped. She was taken to hospital with burns covering 50% of her body. She died 5.5 weeks later from the sepsis that those burns caused. The death was ruled an accident by the coroner. Her older brother Desmond, who was 8 years old and who had been in the bedroom next to the bathroom and had heard every sound, was told by the woman who had put Andrea into that bath that he should say it was an accident, that he should say they had both been in the garden when it happened, and that if he kept that secret, she would stop hitting him. Desmond kept the secret for more than 40 years. The woman at the centre of the case was named Janice Thomas at the time of the events. She was in her late teenage years in 1978, and she was in a relationship with Desmond and Andrea's father, a man also named Desmond Bernard. The relationship made her, in every practical sense, the children's stepmother, even if no formal legal status had attached itself to that role. She was the woman in the house. She was the woman who ran the household when the children's father was not there. She was the woman the children were expected to answer to. Desmond would later describe a household in which both he and his little sister were regularly beaten when they were thought to have misbehaved. The beatings were not unusual events in that house. They were a feature of daily life from roughly 1975 onward, according to the evidence Desmond gave at trial. He was 7 years old when they began. Andrea was even younger. On June 6, 1978, the sequence of events that would kill Andrea began with what was, in the logic of that household, a relatively ordinary infraction. Andrea had been told by Janice to stay in the house and help with cleaning. Instead, Andrea had left. She had gone outside and found her brother. The two children had spent some time together in the street, in the way that children do on a summer day when the alternative is being indoors. When they came home, Janice was furious. Witnesses at the trial heard that her voice when she was angry was loud enough to be heard through walls, loud enough that the way she was shouting that afternoon stood out even in a house where raised voices were not unusual. She beat Andrea. Then she ran a bath. Desmond, 8 years old and already well trained in what to do when the atmosphere in the house became dangerous, went upstairs to his bedroom. His bedroom was directly next to the bathroom. The walls were thin. What happened next, he heard through those walls. He heard Janice telling Andrea to get into the bath. He heard his little sister saying that the bath was too hot. He heard Andrea calling Janice mummy, the word children in that household used for her, and saying, "Please, the bath is too hot, mummy." He heard Janice telling her to get in anyway. He heard his sister screaming. He heard water sounds. He heard the screaming stop. Then he heard Janice calling Andrea's name. Then he heard Janice calling him. She was calling him into the bathroom. When Desmond walked into the bathroom, Andrea was limp. Janice was cradling her in a towel. When Desmond looked at his sister, he could see that the skin on parts of her body was coming away. He was 8 years old. He had just heard his 5-year-old sister screaming through a wall and then go silent, and now he was standing in a bathroom looking at what the scalding water had done to her. Janice looked at him. She told him what he needed to say. She told him to say it was an accident. She told him to say that the 2 children had been in the garden when it happened. She told him that if he kept the secret, she would never beat him again. An ambulance was called. Andrea was taken to hospital. The burns she had suffered covered half of her body. The hospital worked to keep her alive across the weeks that followed. She did not survive. On July 13, 1978, 5 weeks and 1 week after the incident in the bathroom, Andrea Bernard died from the sepsis that her burn injuries had caused. She was 5 years old. A coroner's inquest was held. The original account Janice gave to the coroner was that Andrea had taken a bath independently and had afterwards complained of itchy legs before fainting. The coroner accepted this account. The death was recorded as accidental. It was attributed to sepsis caused by burns, and the burns were attributed to a mishap in the bathroom that no adult had been responsible for. The file was closed. Desmond Bernard grew up carrying what he had heard through that wall. He told no one the full truth for a very long time. He had been promised that the beatings would stop if he kept his silence, and 8-year-olds believe promises made by the adults who control their lives, even when those adults have already demonstrated that they are not trustworthy. Over the years that followed, as he grew into an adult and the events of 1978 settled into the past, he began telling people close to him in fragments. He told those closest to him what he had experienced in that house. He told them what he had heard. He told them what he had seen when he walked into the bathroom. But he had not gone to the police. His sister had been dead for decades. The woman who had done it had gone on with her life. By the time Desmond finally decided to make a formal report, Janice Thomas, who had in the years since become Janice Nix, had built an entirely different public identity. Janice Nix had become, by any external measure, a success story. She had worked as a probation officer for years and had been recognized for that work. In 2021, the year before Desmond went to police, she had published a memoir titled Breaking Out, written with a co-author, which described her journey from difficult beginnings, including involvement in drug dealing, to becoming an award-winning probation officer. The book was received as a story of personal transformation. It was on shelves in bookshops. She had given interviews about it. The person the book described was someone who had turned their life around, who had chosen a path of service and accountability, who worked every day with people who had made mistakes and was helping them find a different direction. The gap between the person in that book and the person Desmond Bernard knew from 1978 was absolute. In September 2022, Desmond went to the Metropolitan Police. He told them that his sister had died in 1978. He told them it had been recorded as an accident. He told them that his stepmother had been responsible for the burns that killed her. He told them that he had been in the room next door. He told them what he had heard. Local officers took the initial report. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police's cold case homicide team took over from there. What the cold case detectives found when they began pulling documents was that most of the records from 1978 had not survived the intervening 44 years intact. Many documents from the local authority archives of that era were gone. Many of the people who had been connected to the case, neighbors, hospital staff, officials who had attended the inquest, had died in the decades between then and 2022. The investigation was not straightforward. It required the detectives to sift through thousands of pages of archival material, looking for fragments of information that could be verified and used. What they eventually found, among those fragments, was a 16-page coroner's report from 1978. That document proved to be essential. The coroner's report contained a description of the injuries Andrea had sustained and the treatment she had received at hospital. It also contained a statement from Janice Nix, taken shortly after Andrea's death. When detectives went to interview Janice in 2022, they did not immediately tell her that her original 1978 statement had been found. They asked her to describe what had happened that day in the house in Thornton Heath. The account she gave in 2022 was significantly different from the one she had given to the coroner in 1978. When detectives then showed her the original document and asked her to explain the discrepancies, she made no comment. She also claimed during the 2022 interview that the coroner had found Andrea's death to be the result of a malfunctioning boiler that had overheated the bathwater. There was no mention of any malfunctioning boiler anywhere in the coroner's report. The claim had no documentary basis whatsoever. Janice Nix was charged, and the case went to trial at Isleworth Crown Court. Desmond Bernard gave evidence. He described in detail what he had heard through the wall on June 6, 1978. He described the screaming. He described his sister calling the water too hot, calling it that over and over while the shouting continued. He described walking into the bathroom and seeing Andrea limp with the skin coming away from her body. He described what Janice had told him to say and what she had promised him if he kept the secret. He had kept that secret through his childhood and into his adult life, and he had come forward with it at the age of 52, more than 40 years after the day it had been extracted from him. Medical experts testified about the nature of the burns. A burns specialist told the court that a child immersed in water hot enough to cause the injuries Andrea had sustained would immediately and instinctively attempt to get out of the water. A child in that situation would try to stand up. A child in that situation would try to lift themselves out. The child would not voluntarily remain seated. The injuries on Andrea's body were consistent with parts of her being held in a submerged position. The prosecution's argument was that the burns could not have been self-inflicted, and that the pattern of the injuries told the story of a child who had been put into the bath and held there. The judge, Mr. Justice Nicholas Lavender, addressed Janice in his sentencing remarks with unusual directness. He told her he was sure she had run the bath. He told her he was sure she knew how hot it was. He told her he was sure she had told Andrea to get in, and that when Andrea said it was too hot, she had either put the child into the water or made her get in, and he told her she had heard the screaming. The jury convicted her of manslaughter. She was also convicted of the assault and ill treatment of Desmond Bernard between 1975 and 1978. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the manslaughter, with 15 months to run concurrently for the offences against Desmond. She cried through most of the sentencing hearing. She wept loudly while the judge read his remarks. She was 67 years old when sentence was passed. Desmond Bernard read a victim impact statement in court. He told the judge that the last memory he had of his sister's life were her piercing screams and his own lying about her death in order to survive. He told the court that Janice's actions had robbed Andrea of her life and had stolen from him the opportunity to grow up with her. He said he had been broken and that he had never been the same since. He addressed Janice directly. He told her that her contrived grief at Andrea's funeral, the lies, the tears, had fooled his family because they could not imagine the unimaginable. He told her she had taken their kindness for weakness and had manipulated them so she would not be found out. He told her the time had come to acknowledge what she had done to Andrea and to himself. Andrea Bernard's biological mother, Angela, had a statement read in court by the prosecutor. Angela described her daughter as so sweet and loving. She said that when Andrea died, it completely destroyed her. She said her daughter had deserved to have a life and not to be lying in a cemetery. She said she thought about her every single day. Andrea Bernard was 5 years old in the summer of 1978. She died in a hospital in South London after spending 5 weeks and 6 days fighting injuries she had no power to prevent. The woman who had made her get into a bath that was too hot had gone on to work in the criminal justice system, had written a book about her life, had given interviews, had been recognized for her professional work. The brother, who had heard everything through the wall, had carried the knowledge for 44 years. He had been told to say it was an accident. For 4 decades, that is what the official record had said. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the mid-20th century but moves to the American South, where a woman named Nanny Doss moved through a series of marriages across multiple states over 3 decades, outliving husband after husband, child after child, and collecting the insurance money each time. She sat down with investigators in Oklahoma in 1954 and told them, while laughing, what she had done. She had been poisoning the people closest to her since the mid-1920s, and nobody had noticed until a doctor ordered an autopsy that was not supposed to be routine. Case 6. Nanny Doss, Blue Mountain, Alabama, in the first decade of the 20th century, was a place that asked very little of its residents, except hard work and endurance. The Hazel family farm sat in the foothills of the Appalachian Range in Calhoun County, close enough to the town of Anniston that the children could see smoke from the industrial works on clear days, but far enough from anywhere else that their daily world was the farm, the fields, and the authority of their father. James Hazel was strict in the manner of a man who has decided that strictness is the only reliable tool available to him. He kept his children out of school to work the land. He forbade his daughters from wearing makeup or attending dances, convinced this would protect them from the attention of men. It did not protect them. Nanny and her sisters were molested anyway, and James refused to believe it when they told him. The world Nanny Hazel was born into on November 4th, 1905, was a world that gave her very little and controlled whatever it did give. The one pleasure that was available to her, the one thing that belonged entirely to her interior life, was her mother's romance magazines. She read them in whatever time was not claimed by the farm. She read the Lonely Hearts columns especially. She read about other people's love stories and decided, very early, that a great romance was the thing that her life was organized around obtaining. She was 16 years old when her father arranged her first marriage. The man was named Charlie Braggs, a co-worker from the linen factory where Nanny had started working, and they had known each other only 4 months when they married in 1921. The marriage was not what the romance magazines had described. Charlie's mother moved into the home and took up most of her son's attention. Charlie disappeared for days at a time without explanation. Nanny began drinking. She began smoking heavily. The couple had 4 daughters in quick succession, and then, in 1927, 2 of the middle girls died within weeks of each other, their deaths attributed to food poisoning. The circumstances were noted and then set aside. Infant mortality was still common enough in rural Alabama in 1927 that 2 small children dying of stomach ailments in the same summer did not immediately prompt a deeper investigation. Charlie Braggs took the oldest daughter and left. He was the only husband Nanny Doss would ever have who survived. He said in later years that he had left because he was frightened of her. He did not elaborate on what he meant. He did not need to. He was still alive. The second husband was Robert Franklin Harrelson, whom Nanny married in 1929. He was an alcoholic with a criminal record for assault. The marriage lasted 16 years. During those years, Nanny's daughter Melvina had 2 children of her own. One of those children, a newborn, died under circumstances that Melvina later described with the specific detail of a person who could not make sense of what she had witnessed. Melvina had been exhausted and sedated after labor, and when she became more alert, she thought she saw her own mother, Nanny, insert something sharp into the baby's head. When she asked her husband and her sister about what she had seen, they confirmed that Nanny had been holding a pin and that Nanny had already told them the baby was dead. A few months later, Melvina's older child, a 2-year-old boy named Robert Lee, died in Nanny's care. His death was attributed to asphyxia from unknown causes. Nanny had taken out a life insurance policy on him before he died. She collected $500. In 1945, Nanny put rat poison into Harrelson's corn whiskey jar. He died that evening. The death was attributed to the predictable consequences of a man who drank the way he drank. Nobody ordered an autopsy. Nobody looked for a reason beyond the obvious. Nanny was free to find husband number 3. She found him through a Lonely Hearts advertisement. His name was Arlie Lanning, and he lived in Lexington, North Carolina. They met and married within 3 days of meeting, which was the kind of romantic speed that Nanny's magazines had always celebrated as a sign of genuine feeling. Ali was an alcoholic and a womanizer, and the marriage was difficult in the specific way that marriages to alcoholic womanizers tend to be. Nanny responded by disappearing for months at a time, traveling, visiting relatives, living according to her own schedule. When she was home, she was, by every account from neighbors and townspeople who knew the couple, a devoted and attentive wife. She cooked for him. She kept the house. She played the role that the community expected of a married woman in that time and place, so convincingly that when Ali died of what was attributed to heart failure, the community consoled her. Not long after his death, the house that had been left by Ali to his sister burned down. The insurance money went to Nanny. Then Ali's mother died in her sleep while Nanny was still in the area, an event that was noted by the community as further evidence of the unfortunate run of losses this particular woman seemed to attract. Nanny left North Carolina and traveled to visit her sister Dovie, who was bedridden with illness. Dovie died shortly after Nanny's arrival. Nanny traveled on. She joined a dating service. The service was called the Diamond Circle Club, and it was the kind of organization that placed lonely men in contact with women who were looking for companionship, and vice versa. It was the post-war version of the Lonely Hearts column, and Nanny had been reading Lonely Hearts columns her entire life. She met a man named Richard Morton in Emporia, Kansas. They married in 1952. By January of 1953, Nanny's mother Louisa had come to live with her and Morton, needing care after a fall that broke her hip. Within days of arriving, Louisa developed severe stomach pains and died. 3 months later, Richard Morton was dead too. His death certificate reflected the standard ailment. Another stomach problem, another sudden decline, another insurance payout. Nanny packed her belongings and boarded a bus to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she had arranged to meet a man she had been corresponding with through another dating service. His name was Samuel Doss. He was a Nazarene minister, a quiet and serious man who had lost his family in a tornado in Arkansas. He was, in almost every respect, the opposite of the romance magazine ideal. He did not allow non-educational television programs in the house. He disapproved of the romance novels that Nanny loved and had organized her entire emotional life around for 50 years. He controlled what she could read. He controlled what she could watch. He was, in the specific way that mattered most to Nanny, an obstacle to the life she had always imagined she deserved. In September 1954, Samuel Doss became ill with what his doctors diagnosed as a severe digestive tract infection. He was hospitalized. He received treatment. He improved enough that the hospital discharged him on October 5, 1954. He walked out of the hospital and went home. That same evening, he died. He had been poisoned with arsenic, the same arsenic that Nanny had been using across 3 decades, in one household after another, in one state after another, in the food and drink she prepared for the people who lived with her. The doctor who had treated Samuel at the hospital was the first physician in 30 years of Nanny Doss's adult life who was suspicious enough to order an autopsy before signing a death certificate. He ordered it because something about the rapidity of the decline, the sudden death of a man he had watched improve and discharged as stabilized, did not fit any natural explanation he could construct. The autopsy revealed an amount of arsenic in Samuel's body that the examining doctors described as enough to kill a horse. Nanny was arrested on November 1, 1954, in Tulsa. She was 48 years old. The interrogation that followed was one of the stranger recorded conversations in the history of American law enforcement. Nanny was not initially cooperative. She spent the first period of her detention reading a romance magazine rather than answering questions. The investigators, recognizing what motivated her and what she valued, made a practical decision. They offered to let her keep the magazine in exchange for answers. She accepted the deal. What followed was a confession delivered over several sessions in a manner so at odds with its content that the reporters who covered the story struggled to find language for it. Nanny described the deaths of her husbands calmly, in chronological order, with occasional flashes of something that looked like amusement. She laughed at certain points. She smiled through others. She described putting rat poison into meals and drinks without visible distress. She described collecting the insurance money after each death with a matter-of-factness that suggested she considered the insurance collection to be the ordinary domestic task it had functionally become in her household. The reporters who were present gave her the nickname that followed her for the rest of her life and into history. They called her the Giggling Granny. The contrast between her appearance, a plump, bespectacled woman in her late 40s who looked like someone's grandmother, which she was, and the content of what she was describing with that smile, was the thing that made her a national sensation in the autumn of 1954. Photographs from the period show her sitting across from police officers and smiling warmly, as if she had been asked to describe a particularly successful batch of preserves rather than 3 decades of poisoning the people she lived with. One photograph shows her laughing while signing a statement in which she admitted to killing 4 husbands. The smile does not reach any recognizable emotional register. It is simply there, constant, while the details of 11 deaths are laid out on the table in front of her. She confessed to the 4 husbands. She maintained, with a consistency that investigators found unconvincing given the forensic evidence, that she had not harmed any of her blood relatives. The bodies told a different story. Exhumations were conducted across multiple states. The remains of Harrelson, Lanning, Morton, and Samuel Doss all contained arsenic or rat poison in significant concentrations. The death of Arlie Lanning's mother, which had occurred while Nanny was in the household, was consistent with poisoning. The death of Nanny's sister Dovie, which had occurred shortly after Nanny's arrival at her bedside, was consistent with poisoning. The deaths of the 2 small children in 1927 were now viewed in a new light. The death of the grandson, the infant with the hatpin, the deaths that had accumulated around her across Alabama and North Carolina and Kansas and Oklahoma over 30 years, were examined and re-examined through the lens of what the autopsy of Samuel Doss had revealed. Oklahoma built its criminal case around the murder of Samuel Doss. That was the death they could prove most cleanly, the death with the freshest evidence, the death ordered into autopsy by a doctor who had seen something that did not fit. They charged her with that killing. Other states, including Alabama and North Carolina and Kansas, filed additional charges but never brought them to trial. The Oklahoma case was the one that mattered, and it moved quickly. On May 17, 1955, Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to the murder of her 5th husband. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. The question of the death penalty was considered and declined, in part because of the attitudes of that era toward executing a woman, and in part because there was some discussion of her mental fitness. The judge later explained that he did not wish to set a poor precedent by executing a woman, a formulation that says more about 1955 than it does about Nanny Doss. She arrived in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1955 and settled into prison life with the same cheerful equanimity that had characterized everything else about her. She reportedly asked if she could work in the kitchen and was told no. She found the refusal funny. She continued smiling. She had been corresponding with a dairy farmer in North Carolina before her arrest, a potential husband number 6, and had sent him a cake. After her arrest, investigators looked at the cake. In the years she spent in prison, she gave interviews and made jokes about her situation. The smile was reported to be consistent across all of them. Nanny Doss died of leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary on June 2, 1965. She was 59 years old. She had killed 11 people across 30 years in at least 5 states, moving from one blended household to the next, functioning as wife and mother and grandmother and stepmother across all of them. And the mechanism she had used was the most domestic one available. She had cooked for them, prepared their food, brought them their drinks, and put the poison in. Every person she killed had eaten or drunk something she had made for them. Every death had been attributed to stomach ailments. Every household she left had accepted the explanation and watched her go. She had found the perfect cover in the most ordinary thing a woman in her world was expected to do, and she had hidden behind it for 3 decades before a single doctor in Tulsa in 1954 decided that the story did not add up. The romance magazines she had read all her life described a love that was total and consuming and meant to be. Nanny told investigators that money had not been her motive. She told them she had been looking for the perfect romance. She told them she had been searching her whole life for what the magazines had promised. 11 people died while she was looking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes the story to Idaho and Arizona in 2019, where a woman named Lori Vallow had joined a doomsday religious group and had begun to classify the people around her as either saved or dark. Two of those people were her own children. By the time investigators understood what had happened, Tylee was 16, JJ was 7, and both of them had been buried in the backyard of a man their mother was planning to marry, a man whose own wife had died under suspicious circumstances 2 weeks before the wedding. Case 7. Lori Vallow, Daybell. By 2018, Lori Vallow had been married 4 times. She had 3 children from those marriages, and she had spent most of her adult life presenting herself to the communities she moved through as a devoted and capable mother. People who knew her in the earlier years described warmth and patience, and a household that functioned the way households are supposed to function. What nobody around her could see, because it was still forming in the interior of her own belief system, was that she had begun to sort the people in her life into 2 categories: the saved and the dark, the living and the already gone. By the time that framework had fully taken hold, 2 of the people she had placed in the second category were her own children. The third was a woman named Tammy Daybell, whose only connection to Lori was that Tammy's husband was the man Lori intended to marry as soon as Tammy was no longer alive to prevent it. Lori Vallow was born Lori Cox in Loma Linda, California, in June of 1973. She grew up in a Mormon family whose parents had strong views about the authority of the individual over the state, views that would later echo in the religious framework she adopted. She married for the first time at 19. The marriage ended quickly. She married again in 1995 and had a son named Colby in 1996, before that marriage ended too. In 2001, she married a man named Joseph Ryan and had a daughter named Tylee in 2002. That marriage also ended. In 2006, she married her 4th husband, a businessman named Charles Vallow, and settled in Arizona. She brought Tylee and Colby into that household. In 2014, she and Charles adopted a 7-year-old boy named Joshua, known to his family as JJ. JJ had autism and had come into their lives through Charles's extended family. Lori was, by the accounts of the people who knew them in those earlier years, an attentive and capable mother. Friends described her as patient with JJ, creative with Tylee, warm in the way that mothers who have organized their lives around their children can be warm. Around 2017, something in Lori's interior life began to shift. She had started reading the books of a self-published apocalyptic author from rural Idaho named Chad Daybell. Chad and his wife Tammy had 5 children and lived on a property in Salem, Idaho. He had founded a small publishing company through which he produced novels about the end of times and the spiritual warfare between light and darkness. He had begun giving talks at religious conferences about his visions of the future. At one of those conferences, in St. George, Utah, in the autumn of 2018, Lori and Chad met each other in person. By the account of everyone who observed them during that period, the connection between them was immediate and consuming. They began exchanging messages through burner phones within weeks. The belief system that Chad had developed and that Lori absorbed during this period was a significant deviation from mainstream Latter-day Saint teaching, though it used the language and some of the framework of that tradition. Chad taught that certain people carried a light rating, a measure of their spiritual purity and alignment with the coming events of the last days. People who had a sufficiently dark rating could be considered, in his framework, to already be spiritually dead. He called these people zombies. Once a person was designated a zombie, the obligation of care or love that would normally apply to a family member was, in this framework, no longer operative. They were already gone. What was left in their body was darkness. By late 2018 and into early 2019, Lori and Chad were applying this framework to the people around them. Evidence introduced at trial showed that as early as October 2018, they had begun discussing the deaths of Tammy Daybell, Lori's children JJ and Tylee, and others. They were communicating constantly, mostly through burner phones that were replaced regularly. They spoke in the language of their shared belief system. The people who needed to die were described in terms of their spiritual darkness. The killings, when they came, were framed within that language as acts not of murder, but of liberation or necessity. Charles Vallow, Laurie's fourth husband, had grown deeply concerned about his wife's changing behavior. He had confronted her about her relationship with Chad. He had sent an email to Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife, 11 days before his own death, informing her that their spouses were having an affair. Tammy opened the email and deleted it without responding, and blocked Charles from contacting her again. On July 11, 2019, Charles went to Laurie's home in Chandler, Arizona, to pick up JJ for a scheduled visit. Laurie's brother, Alex Cox, was present in the home. An argument broke out. Alex Cox shot Charles Vallow. Charles died at the scene. Alex told police it was self-defense. The investigation at that stage did not result in charges against Laurie. Alex was not charged. The family moved forward. Laurie and her 2 children relocated to Rexburg, Idaho, to be close to Chad. Alex Cox also relocated there, moving into the same apartment complex. On September 8, 2019, Laurie, JJ, Tylee, and Alex Cox went to Yellowstone National Park. A photograph taken that day shows the 4 of them together. It is the last known photograph of Tylee Ryan alive. She was 16 years old. The photograph shows her laughing. The morning after the trip to Yellowstone, investigators later established through cell phone data that Alex Cox spent approximately 2 hours in Chad Daybell's backyard. 14 minutes after his phone data showed him leaving the property, Chad Daybell sent a text to his wife Tammy. The text mentioned that he had spotted a raccoon along the fence and had shot it. He said the raccoon was now in their pet cemetery. JJ was last seen alive on September 22, 2019. He was 7 years old. He had autism. He wore red pajamas in the last photograph taken of him. By that point, both children were dead, and at least one of them had been buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. In October 2019, approximately 1 month after the children disappeared, Tammy Daybell died in her home. She was 49 years old. The initial cause of death was recorded as natural causes. 2 weeks after Tammy's death, Laurie and Chad were married on a beach in Hawaii. JJ's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, who had been trying to reach JJ without success for weeks, finally contacted Rexburg police in late November and told them she had not been able to speak to or see her grandson. Police went to Laurie's home. Laurie told them JJ was safe and staying in Arizona with a friend. That friend, when contacted, denied that JJ was there. Police then established that Tylee was also missing. A nationwide search began. Laurie and Chad traveled back to Hawaii. Investigators obtained a court order requiring Laurie to produce her children within 5 days. She did not comply. She was arrested in Hawaii on February 20, 2020, and extradited to Idaho. In December 2019, growing suspicion about the circumstances of Tammy Daybell's death led investigators to exhume her body. The autopsy that followed determined that she had been killed. She had been asphyxiated. The cause of death was no longer natural causes. On June 9, 2020, investigators executed a search warrant on Chad Daybell's property in Salem. In the area near what the family had used as a pet cemetery, they found 2 shallow graves. Inside them were the remains of JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan. Tylee's remains had been burned and dismembered. The condition of what was left of the 16-year-old's body was described by the sentencing judge as among the most disturbing things anyone connected to the case would ever have to process. JJ had been buried wrapped in a plastic bag. Both children had been in the ground since September 2019, while their mother was in Hawaii, posting photographs of herself on social media and later arranging a beachside wedding. The trial of Laurie Vallow Daybell began in April 2023 in Ada County, Idaho. The prosecution built its case around the belief framework Laurie and Chad had developed together, the communications between them on burner phones, the financial motive of continuing to collect the children's Social Security survivor benefit payments after their deaths, and the testimony of people who had been part of their social and religious circle. A close friend of Laurie's named Melanie Gibb testified that Laurie had told her Tylee had become a zombie. Others described conversations in which JJ was also referred to in terms that indicated he was considered spiritually dark or already gone. The defense offered no witness testimony. Laurie did not take the stand. On May 12, 2023, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Laurie was convicted of the first-degree murders of both Tylee and JJ, and of conspiring to murder Tammy Daybell. She showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. Judge Stephen Boyce sentenced her on July 31, 2023, to 3 consecutive terms of life, without the possibility of parole. Before delivering the sentence, he told her that she had chosen the most evil and destructive path possible, while better options were available to her. He noted that while she was on her honeymoon in Hawaii, her children were lying in shallow graves in Idaho. He said their bodies had been burned and mutilated and buried like animals. He said he saw no sign of remorse. He noted the disgust he had observed on jurors' faces throughout the trial and said the images from the case would haunt everyone who had encountered them. Chad Daybell was tried separately and convicted in May 2024 of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. He was sentenced to death. He awaits execution in an Idaho maximum security facility. Laurie was subsequently extradited to Arizona, where she stood trial twice on charges related to the death of her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, and the attempted murder of her niece's ex-husband. She represented herself at both Arizona trials. In April 2025, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Charles. She was given additional life sentences. She remains in custody, serving multiple consecutive life terms across Idaho and Arizona. Tylee Ryan was 16 years old in September 2019. JJ Vallow was 7. Tylee wanted to be an actress. JJ had spent the years of his short life navigating a world that was harder for him to process than it is for most 7-year-olds, and his adoptive mother had once been described by the people who knew her as unusually patient with him, unusually kind. By the time the search for both children was formally launched, they had been in the ground for 2 months. Their mother was telling investigators that JJ was fine, that he was with a friend in Arizona, that everything was accounted for. She had, by that point, already married the man in whose backyard their bodies were buried. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in the Broaden section and moves to the Pacific Northwest, where a woman named Jennifer Hart and her wife Sarah had built a public life organized around 6 adopted children and a social media presence that showed the family at music festivals and on hiking trails and in matching shirts with hand-painted signs. Behind that image, the children were starving. When Child Protective Services finally came to the door in Washington state, the family was already in the car. Case 8, Jennifer Hart. The photograph that most people remember from the Hart family story was taken in November 2014 in Portland, Oregon, during a protest that had drawn a large crowd to the streets in the aftermath of the Ferguson shooting. In the middle of the demonstration, a 12-year-old boy named Devonte Hart stood on the sidewalk holding a handmade sign that said "Free Hugs." He was wearing a cowboy hat. He was crying. A white police officer named Brett Barnum noticed the boy and walked over and asked him what was wrong. Devonte couldn't quite put it into words. The officer opened his arms. Devonte stepped into them. A photographer named Johnny Nguyen was nearby and captured the moment. The small black boy in the cowboy hat and the police officer holding each other in the middle of the street while the demonstration moved around them. The photograph went everywhere. News organizations around the world published it. People called it the hug felt round the world. Devonte's adoptive mother, Jennifer Hart, wrote about it on Facebook and described raising him and his 5 siblings as the greatest privilege of her life. 3.5 years later, Devonte Hart's body was never recovered from the Pacific Ocean. Jennifer Jean Hart and Sarah Margaret Hart were both born in 1979 in South Dakota, a year and a few weeks apart. They met at Northern State University, where both majored in elementary education and where Sarah focused on special education. They moved in together and eventually built a life around a clear and consistent idea of what they wanted that life to look like. A large family, a progressive household, a home full of children who had been given a second chance. They began fostering children in Minnesota in 2004. Their first foster child was a teenage girl. In 2006, they adopted 3 siblings from Colorado County, Texas, through a private adoption agency in Minnesota. The children were Marquise, who was 8 at the time of placement, Hannah, who was 4, and Abigail, who was 2. In 2008, they adopted 3 more siblings from Houston. Those children were Devonte, who was 5, Jeremiah, who was 4, and Sierra, who was 3. The 6 children came from 2 separate biological families, all of them black, adopted by 2 white women from South Dakota, who presented themselves to the world as a portrait of loving and unconventional family life. The public image the Harts built on Facebook across the years that followed was remarkable in its consistency. Photographs of the children appeared regularly, usually smiling, often in matching or coordinated clothing, at music festivals and national parks, and progressive political rallies and hiking trails. Jennifer wrote posts about justice and race and parenting and love. She described her family with warmth and specificity. The children looked happy. People who followed the page felt good about the family they were watching. The image was so carefully maintained and so thoroughly at odds with what was happening inside the household that people who knew the family casually found it almost impossible to reconcile when the truth finally came out. What was happening inside the household had been happening for years before anyone stopped it. In Minnesota in 2008, a school teacher noticed bruising on Hannah's arm. Hannah told the teacher that Jennifer had hit her with a belt. The Harts told police that Hannah had fallen down the stairs. No charges were filed. In Oregon in 2010, Abigail told investigators that she had been beaten by Jennifer for stealing a penny. The bruises on her body supported the account. Sarah Hart stepped forward and took responsibility for the assault, claiming it was she, rather than Jennifer, who had struck Abigail. Sarah was charged with misdemeanor domestic assault and sentenced to community service. No further action was taken. In Oregon, school officials made multiple reports to Child Protective Services after children showed up visibly hungry, rummaging through other students' lunches. When school staff told Sarah that Hannah had reported not eating that day, Sarah accused Hannah of playing the food card and instructed the school to give her water instead. The pattern continued across multiple states. When one state began to ask questions, the family moved to another. Minnesota gave way to Oregon. Oregon gave way to Washington. Each time, the family arrived somewhere new, and the public Facebook page continued presenting photographs of children at national parks, children at festivals, children with their arms around each other, children who looked, in the frames Jennifer chose to post, entirely fine. By the time the family had settled in Woodland in southwest Washington in 2017, the cumulative record of abuse complaints stretched across 3 states and more than a decade. No single agency had seen all of it. No single caseworker had the full picture. The children had passed through the child welfare systems of multiple jurisdictions, and none of those systems had assembled the whole story in time to act on it. In Woodland, a neighbor named Bruce DeKalb and his wife Dana had befriended Devonte over the months the family had lived nearby. Devonte was coming to their house regularly and asking for food. He told them that the children were punished by having meals withheld. He begged them not to tell his mothers that he had told them this. The DeKalbs had been giving him food at their back door for some time. In March 2018, Dana DeKalb called Washington State's Child Protective Services. She told them what Devonte had been telling her. Child Protective Services scheduled an investigation. On March 23, 2018, a CPS caseworker came to the Hart family home in Woodland. Nobody answered the door. The caseworker left. That same day, evidence later established, Jennifer and Sarah Hart loaded their 6 children into their GMC Yukon and left Washington. They drove south through Oregon. The next evening, surveillance footage at a Safeway store in Fort Bragg, California, recorded Jennifer purchasing bananas. The family stayed in the Fort Bragg area that night. On March 26, 2018, they continued down Highway 1 along the Mendocino coast. The GPS device in the vehicle was turned off for the first time on that stretch of road. At some point in the early afternoon, Jennifer pulled the Yukon into a gravel turnout near the cliff edge of Highway 1, approximately 100 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The vehicle sat at that pullout for a period of time. Then Jennifer pressed the accelerator to full throttle. The vehicle accelerated from a complete stop to approximately 20 miles per hour in 3 seconds. There were no brake marks on the gravel. The Yukon went over the cliff and fell 100 feet onto the rocks and into the ocean below. None of the 8 people inside were wearing seatbelts. Friends would later tell investigators that Jennifer was ordinarily so vigilant about seatbelts that she refused to start the car until every occupant was buckled in. Jennifer's blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was above the legal limit, a detail that surprised people who knew her because she rarely drank. Sarah and 2 of the children had high levels of diphenhydramine in their systems. Diphenhydramine is the active ingredient in Benadryl, an over-the-counter antihistamine that in large doses causes sedation and eventual organ failure. The investigation later established that Sarah's system contained the equivalent of 42 single doses of the medication. The children's systems showed levels consistent with having been dosed without their knowledge or consent. On Sarah's phone, investigators recovered a series of Google searches conducted while the family was on the road. The searches included questions about the lethality of Benadryl, the nature of death by drowning, and whether drowning was painful. One of her last searches was for no-kill animal shelters for dogs. The family's 2 dogs had been left at the house in Woodland. A California Highway Patrol investigator named Jake Slates described the family's final days in detail during the coroner's inquest that was convened the following year. His testimony walked through the timeline from the moment CPS came to the Woodland door to the moment the Yukon went over the cliff. He told the inquest that in his view, Jennifer and Sarah had made a decision at some point on the Mendocino coast. He said that if they could not keep their children, then nobody was going to have their children. He said the evidence showed that the crash was not an accident and was not a mechanical failure. The vehicle had no mechanical defects. The data recorder confirmed that the throttle was at 100% and that the brakes were not touched. The bodies of Marcus, Jeremiah, and Abigail were found near the overturned vehicle the same day. Sierra's body was recovered from the ocean weeks later. Hannah was eventually identified through DNA matching from remains. Devontae was never found. A Superior Court judge issued a death certificate for him based on the totality of the evidence, but his body was not recovered. He was 15 years old. He was the boy who had stood on a Portland street in 2014 in a cowboy hat and cried and been photographed holding a police officer, and the photograph had gone around the world, and his mother had written about it on Facebook, and people who saw the image had felt, for a moment, that something real and good had happened in the middle of a difficult time. Jennifer had described the moment publicly as evidence of the family she and Sarah had built. Devontae was starving inside that family. He was coming to the neighbor's back door and asking for food and begging them not to tell. He was 15 when the car went over the cliff. The coroner's jury convened in March 2019 and deliberated for less than an hour. They returned unanimous verdicts. Jennifer and Sarah Hart had died by suicide. Their 6 adopted children had died at the hands of another. The Mendocino County Sheriff, Tom Allman, said he accepted the verdict and that the tragedy of the 6 children murdered should never be forgotten. One of the jurors, a man from Mendocino County named Tony Howard, told reporters afterward that reaching the decision had not been the hard part. He said dealing with the whole tragedy was the hard part. The Hart case provoked a national conversation about the adoption and child welfare system that placed these children. 6 children had passed through the systems of Texas, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. Abuse complaints had been filed in multiple states. Each time, the family had moved before the investigation concluded. No single agency had seen all of the reports. A book published in 2023 by journalist Roxana Asgharian, titled "We Were Once a Family," traced the lives of the children's biological families and examined in detail how the welfare systems that were supposed to protect these 6 children had instead delivered them to a household where they were hungry and afraid, and where the photographs posted on Facebook bore almost no relationship to the lives being lived behind the doors. The house in Woodland, Washington was empty when investigators came after the crash. The dogs were there, the children's belongings were there. Jennifer's characteristic neatness was visible in the way the rooms were arranged. Whatever had been packed for the trip was already in the Yukon, at the bottom of a cliff in Mendocino County. The Facebook page, with its years of photographs of children at music festivals and hiking trails and holding hand-painted signs, was still there too, untouched after March 23rd, the last day anyone came to the door. Marcus Hart was 19 years old. Hannah was 16. Devontae was 15. Jeremiah and Abigail were both 14. Sierra was 12. The oldest had been placed with the Harts when he was 8 years old. The youngest had been 3. All 6 of them had spent most of their conscious lives inside a family that was one thing in public and another thing entirely in the kitchen at mealtimes. The last thing any of them experienced was a car going off a cliff in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon on the California coast, driven by the woman who had taken them from the child welfare system and given them her last name. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case brings the story to its final entry, and it moves to Springfield, Missouri in 2012, where a church organist and trained nurse named Diane Stalte had decided that the people living in her house were obstacles. The first obstacle was her husband Mark. The second was her autistic son Sean. She put antifreeze into their drinks and waited. Nobody noticed until a church pastor made a phone call that changed everything. Case 9. Andrea Yates, Clear Lake, Texas, is a suburb southeast of Houston, the kind of planned residential community that grew up around the NASA Johnson Space Center in the 1960s and never stopped growing. The streets are wide and the houses are large, and the families who live in them tend to be educated and employed and outwardly stable in the way that communities built around aerospace engineering tend to attract. Andrea Yates had lived in Clear Lake with her husband Rusty and their 5 children for years before the morning of June 20th, 2001. She had been a registered nurse. She had been a class valedictorian. She had been, by every account from every person who knew her before the illness took hold, a woman of discipline and warmth and genuine devotion to her children. By 9 o'clock on that Wednesday morning in June, Rusty had left for work at NASA. His mother was scheduled to arrive at 10. In the hour between those two events, Andrea filled the bathtub and drowned all 5 of her children. The descent that led to that morning had been visible to the doctors treating Andrea for years. The first crisis came in 1999, after the birth of Luke, her 4th child. Andrea had attempted suicide and was hospitalized. A psychiatrist named Eileen Starbranch, who treated her during that hospitalization, warned both Andrea and Rusty in explicit terms that another pregnancy would guarantee future psychotic depression. The warning was unambiguous. Within 7 weeks of Andrea's discharge, she was pregnant with Mary. She stopped taking her antipsychotic medication during the pregnancy, as is common practice to avoid fetal exposure, and her mental state deteriorated again after Mary's birth in November 2000. In March 2001, Andrea's father died. The loss sent her into a severe decline. She stopped taking medication entirely, mutilated herself, stopped feeding Mary, and became so incapacitated that she required emergency hospitalization. She was admitted and treated and discharged. She was admitted again weeks later when she relapsed into what her doctor described as a near catatonic state. In the period between her second hospitalization and the drownings, she was under the care of a psychiatrist named Mohammed Saeed, who made the clinical decision to discharge her on May 14, 2001, 5 weeks before the deaths. The discharge came with an instruction, documented in the medical records, that Andrea was not to be left alone with the children. Her psychiatrist told Rusty that there needed to be supervision at all times. Rusty had a different view. He had announced at a family gathering the weekend before the drownings that he was going to leave Andrea alone for an hour each morning and an hour each evening, so that she would not become completely dependent on him and his mother, and would develop some independence and confidence in her own mothering. Andrea's mother, who was at the gathering, expressed immediate alarm. She told Rusty that Andrea was not stable enough for this arrangement. Rusty's plan was put into place anyway. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work at approximately 9 o'clock. His mother was scheduled to arrive at 10. In the hour between those two events, Andrea Yates filled the bathtub and began drowning her children one by one. She started with the youngest. She drowned Luke first, then Paul, then John. She carried each of their bodies to the master bedroom and laid them on the bed and covered them with a sheet. She went back to the bathroom and drowned Mary, the infant, leaving her floating in the water. As she stood over the tub, Noah, the oldest, came into the bathroom. He was 7 years old. He looked at his sister in the water and asked his mother what was wrong with Mary. He understood what was happening. He ran. Andrea chased her 7-year-old son through the house, caught him, and brought him back to the bathroom. She drowned him there, alongside his dead sister. She then left both of them in the tub and went to the telephone. She called 911 and told the dispatcher it was time, that she needed an officer. She did not say why. Then she called Rusty at NASA and told him to come home. He asked which child. She said all of them. The police officer who arrived first testified that Andrea answered the door with wet hair and wet clothing and a calm that was worse than any agitation. She told him she had killed her kids. She said it plainly. She was arrested. A grand jury indicted her on capital murder charges for the deaths of Noah, John, and Mary. The state of Texas sought the death penalty. What Andrea Yates believed she had done on the morning of June 20th, 2001, was not what the prosecution described, and not what the neighbors imagined, and not what the tabloid coverage projected. She believed, in the full grip of a psychosis that had been building for years and that had been documented extensively in her medical records, that she had saved her children from Satan. She had been living with a delusional belief since 1999 that television cameras had been installed throughout her home to monitor the quality of her mothering. She believed that one of Satan was literally inside her body, that she had been contaminated, and that the contamination had passed to her children. She told a psychiatrist in the jail after her arrest that she had killed the children to save their souls, so that they would go to heaven as innocents rather than grow up under her corrupted influence and be damned. She had reached this conclusion not through hatred of her children, but through a systematic psychotic logic that the illness had built inside her while she was alone in the house with 5 children under the age of 7 and no one with her to see it happening. The first trial in 2002 was defined by the question of whether that psychotic belief constituted legal insanity under Texas law. The standard in Texas requires that a defendant did not know that what they were doing was wrong at the time of the act. The prosecution argued that Andrea had known it was wrong because she had waited until Rusty left before filling the tub, and because she had locked the family dog in its crate before beginning, both of which suggested that she understood she was about to do something that others would try to stop. The defense argued that those actions were consistent with psychotic logic, rather than awareness of wrongdoing. The jury sided with the prosecution. Andrea was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The conviction was overturned in 2005, when it emerged that one of the prosecution's expert witnesses had given false testimony. A forensic psychiatrist named Park Dietz had claimed during the trial that Andrea had gotten the idea to drown her children from an episode of the television series Law and Order, in which a mother drowned her children and was subsequently found not guilty by reason of insanity. No such episode had ever aired. The false testimony was material to the jury's deliberation because it went to the question of whether Andrea had planned the killings to achieve a specific legal outcome. The conviction was vacated and a retrial was ordered. The second trial was held in 2006. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea Yates was committed to the North Texas State Hospital. She was later transferred to Kerrville State Hospital, a lower-security mental health facility in the Texas Hill Country, where she has lived since 2007. She has declined multiple opportunities to appear before the parole board or seek release. The Yates Children Memorial Fund, established by her attorneys George and Mary Parnham in the aftermath of the case to raise awareness about postpartum depression and psychosis, has continued operating in her children's names. Andrea has been described by those who have contact with her as engaged with the fund's work and aware of what it does. She was a registered nurse before she was a mother. She spent years watching the physical deterioration of cancer patients and understanding in professional terms what illness does to a body. She had no equivalent framework for what was happening to her own mind. Rusty Yates stood by Andrea throughout the first trial. He told reporters in 2001 that she had loved those kids. He divorced her in 2005 while she was in custody. He remarried in 2006. He has given interviews in the years since that maintain his belief that Andrea's illness, not Andrea herself, killed the children, and that the conditions of their daily life, including his own decisions about supervision and medical care, contributed to the outcome. The 5 children were Noah, 7, John, 5, Paul, 4, Luke, 2, Mary, 6 months. They were alive in the morning and in the ground by the end of the week. Andrea Yates was a class valedictorian and a registered nurse who had spent years around serious illness and understood in clinical terms what it meant to be sick. She did not recognize what was happening inside her own mind. Her doctors saw it. Her mother saw it. The psychiatrist who discharged her 5 weeks before the drownings had told her husband in documented language that she could not be left alone with the children. The hour between Rusty leaving for work and his mother arriving for the handoff was the hour that the warning had been trying to prevent. It lasted 60 minutes. It ended with 5 children under sheets in a bedroom and their mother standing in the kitchen, soaking wet, calling the police. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case stays in the American Midwest and moves to Springfield, Missouri, where a church organist named Diane Storte had spent years telling her congregation and her community one story about her family while living a completely different one at home. The method she chose was antifreeze. The people she chose were her husband, her autistic son, and her oldest daughter. The case broke open because of a diary and an anonymous phone call from a pastor who had been watching the pattern from close enough to see what everyone else had missed. Case 10. Diane Storte, Springfield, Missouri, is a city in the Ozarks Plateau, a working-class college town with a strong evangelical Christian tradition, the kind of place where people know their neighbors through church, and where a family's standing in the community is partly measured by their attendance and participation in the congregation. The Stouter family had that standing. Diane Stouter played the organ at Redeemer Lutheran Church, which is the kind of role that places a person at the center of the community's weekly rhythm. She was visible and consistent and trusted. Her husband Mark was the lead singer and guitarist of a local blues band called Messing with Destiny, a man who was cheerful in public and well liked by his bandmates, though he earned little from the music, and the domestic financial weight fell primarily on Diane, who had trained as a nurse and later moved into insurance work. They had been high school sweethearts. They had 4 children together. By almost every measure that the community around them could observe, they were an ordinary Springfield family. What nobody outside the household knew, and what the household itself would eventually fracture under the weight of, was what Diane Stouter actually thought of the people she was living with. She thought her husband was lazy. She told investigators later that he had a bad temper and that he would throw things at her when he was angry. She said she had reached a point where she hated his guts. She said she had considered asking him to leave the home, but worried he might hurt himself. She described Sean, her 26-year-old autistic son who still lived at home, as more than a bother, more than a pest. She said he followed her around. She said he was always there, always in the house, always needing something, and she had reached a limit she could not see past. She described Sarah, her 24-year-old daughter, who had graduated from Missouri State University with a degree but could not find stable work and had accumulated significant student loan debt, as another financial weight she did not want to carry. The 4th child was Rachel, 22 years old, who played the flute and excelled in math and chemistry and writing, and who was, by Diane's own description and by the evidence of her Facebook posts, the child she actually loved. The research began before the first killing. Diane and Rachel sat down together and looked for a method. They considered poisonous plants. They considered other substances. They settled on antifreeze, specifically on a variety of antifreeze purchased through the internet, because they had established that antifreeze sold online for specialty automotive purposes often lacked the bittering agent that is added to commercial products, precisely to make accidental ingestion detectable. Without the bittering agent, the antifreeze had no strong taste. It could be mixed into a drink without being noticed. The active toxic component of antifreeze is ethylene glycol, which causes kidney failure and neurological damage as it is processed by the body, and which is not part of standard toxicology screening during autopsies. Unless a medical examiner specifically tests for it, deaths caused by ethylene glycol poisoning can easily be attributed to natural causes, particularly in an older person with a history of poor health. Mark Stouter did not have a history of poor health exactly, but he drank, and he was 61 years old, and the deaths that were most easily attributed to lifestyle were deaths in people whose lifestyles gave examiners something to point to. Diane began adding the antifreeze to his Gatorade, the sports drink he consumed regularly around the house. On April 8, 2012, the Stouter family went to church. It was Easter Sunday. Mark had not been feeling well and stayed home. His bandmate Rob Mancuso later recalled that Mark had been unwell in the days before his death. He died that day when the medical examiner examined the body and noted a ring of dried blood around the mouth, which is consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning, but also potentially explainable by other causes. The death was attributed to natural causes. Mark was 61 years old. He drank regularly, and the examiner did not look for what no one had suggested looking for. The body was cremated. Diane collected $20,000 from his life insurance policy and used it to move the family to a larger home in a nicer part of Springfield. Sean Stalter died 147 days after his father. He was 26 years old. He had been diagnosed with autism as a child and had lived at home throughout his adult life. His death was reported to police by Diane, who said she had found him on his bedroom floor and that he had a history of seizures. An autopsy was performed because of the proximity of two deaths in the same family over such a short period, but the autopsy did not test for ethylene glycol, and Sean's death was attributed to his prior medical conditions. Blood and tissue samples from the autopsy were retained. The body was cremated. Family members were not formally notified of Sean's death by Diane. A relative discovered it through other means. A bandmate of Mark's who attended the household in the period after Sean's death recalled that Diane's demeanor was unusual. He said she was behaving like she was hosting a party. There was no sadness. He assumed it was her way of grieving. By the time Diane turned her attention to Sarah, the pattern of the household had been established. Two people were dead, and the deaths had been accepted as natural. The insurance money had been collected and spent. Diane was living in the larger house with Rachel and the youngest daughter, Brianna, who was 9 years old and had learning disabilities, and was enrolled in 4th grade. Sarah, the oldest daughter, had moved back home after struggling to find stable employment following her graduation. She had student loans, she had no job. She was, in Diane's accounting, an expense she had decided not to continue bearing. Diane put antifreeze in Sarah's drinks. Sarah began developing the symptoms that ethylene glycol produces as the body processes it: nausea, vomiting, declining alertness. In June of 2013, Sarah's condition deteriorated enough that Diane drove her to the emergency room. Sarah was admitted in critical condition. Her kidneys were failing. Her brain was showing damage. The doctors ran test after test and could not identify a cause. None of the standard tests they ran showed what was in her system. At the same time Sarah was in the ICU, Diane was telling hospital staff about an upcoming vacation to Florida that she was planning to take regardless of her daughter's condition. A nurse who observed this and was troubled by it spoke to the doctor overseeing Sarah's case. The doctor was troubled by it too. On June 11, 2013, a caller contacted the Springfield Police Department anonymously and told the dispatcher that there had been 2 deaths in the Stauder family and that the daughter, now in the hospital, may have been poisoned. The caller said the deaths of the husband and son might be connected to what was happening to Sarah. The caller was later identified as the family's church pastor, Jeff Sippy, who had been watching the pattern of the household from a position of trust and had decided that what he was seeing required him to speak. His phone call, made from the institutional position of a pastor reporting concerns about a family in his congregation, was the thing that cracked the case open. Detective Neil McCamus of the Springfield Police Department pulled the reports on Mark and Sean's deaths and looked at the tissue samples that had been retained from Sean's autopsy. He arranged for those samples to be tested for ethylene glycol. The results came back positive. Sean Staute had been poisoned with antifreeze. McCamus then arranged for Sarah to be tested for the same substance. Those results also came back positive. The substance that had been placed in Sarah's drinks was the same substance that had killed her brother. McCamus went to the hospital and spoke to the doctor treating Sarah, who confirmed that the ethylene glycol finding explained every symptom Sarah had presented with and that there was no natural explanation for her condition. On June 20th, 2013, Diane and Rachel Stauter were asked to come to the Springfield Police Department voluntarily. They both came. Diane was interviewed by Detective McCamus. She denied involvement initially. She offered an alternative explanation, suggesting at one point that Mark and Sean had been drinking antifreeze voluntarily as a form of suicide attempt. When McCamus pressed her on the evidence, she changed course. She confessed. She told McCamus that she had hated Mark. She said he had thrown things at her when he was angry. She said she had reached a point where she simply could not endure his presence any longer. She described Sean as more than a pest who was always in the house and could not be left alone. She described Sarah as a financial obligation she had decided to eliminate. When McCamus asked her to characterize what she had done, she told him, "I am not a perpetual killer, I am just stupid." She told him she regretted doing it. She told him she had screwed up her whole family. Rachel was interviewed separately. She told investigators that her mother had brought the idea up, and that they had then discussed it. A search of the Stauder home uncovered Rachel's diary. In one entry dated June 13, 2011, more than 10 months before the first killing, Rachel had written about how sad it was to realize that her father would pass on in the next 2 months, that Sean would follow shortly after, and that things would be tough for a while but would work out. Rachel's diary had predicted the deaths of her father and brother before they happened. When investigators confronted Rachel with the diary, she confirmed her involvement. She said she had initially objected to poisoning Sean because she believed their mother could have placed him in assisted living rather than killing him. She said their mother had insisted. They had argued about it, and Diane had prevailed. Diane was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Mark and Sean, and 1 count of first-degree assault for the poisoning of Sarah. Rachel was charged with the same 2 murder counts and 1 assault count. Sarah survived. The neurological damage she sustained from the ethylene glycol poisoning was permanent. By the time of the sentencing hearings, she was living in an assisted living facility. Her university education, and the life she had been building toward, interrupted permanently by poison her own mother had put in her drinks. The youngest daughter, Brianna, the 9-year-old with learning disabilities who had been in 4th grade when her father died, was placed in foster care following the arrests. Diane pleaded guilty to all charges in January 2016. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Rachel pleaded guilty in May 2015 to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault. She was sentenced to 2 life terms with eligibility for parole after 42.5 years. At her sentencing, Rachel addressed Sarah directly in the courtroom. She told her she was sorry she had not found the courage to stand up for what was right. Sarah Stauder survived being poisoned by her own mother with antifreeze. She sat in the courtroom where her mother and sister were sentenced, and she heard what was said. The damage to her brain and kidneys was not something the doctors could reverse. The life she would have going forward was the life that the ethylene glycol in her drinks had left her with. She had graduated from college. She had come home to figure out the next step. She had not known that the woman who raised her had already decided what the next step was going to be. Mark Stauder played the blues in a band called Messing with Destiny. Sean Stauder had a special interest in a particular subject, in the way that many people on the autism spectrum develop deep and specific knowledge of the things that matter to them, and he knew everything about it, according to the people who described him. Both of them were dead within 5 months of each other in 2012. Their deaths attributed to natural causes, their bodies cremated, the insurance money collected and spent on a larger house in a nicer neighborhood. The pastor who made the anonymous phone call to the Springfield Police Department was the reason any of it came out at all. He had watched the family from inside the congregation and had decided that what he was seeing could not be ignored any longer. The call he made from a church position was the one that saved Sarah's life and built the case that put Diane and Rachel Stauder in prison for the rest of their lives. The 10 women in this collection moved through the role of mother or stepmother and used what that role gave them access to. They had the food, they had the drinks, they had the bath, they had the bread, they had the suitcase. They were the ones who were trusted, the ones the household depended on, the ones inside the door. Every case on this list is a different version of the same terrible fact, that the people who are closest to us, the people who are supposed to stand between us and the worst things in the world, sometimes are the worst thing in the world. The families in these 10 cases did not see it coming. Most of them never had any reason to. They opened the door, they sat down at the table, they got into the bath, they ate the bread that was brought to them, they trusted the person who had been given the trust that comes with being the one who takes care of you. In every one of these cases, that was the last mistake they made. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.